All right, wonderful. Hello, everyone. I see a good number of friendly faces, but if you do not know me, my name is Thorin Perego with Business Forward. On behalf of our team and our friends at Spitfire, we're so glad you were able to join us for our interactive training today on speaking on panels. Today's training focuses on best practices on how to effectively communicate your perspective and field questions, specifically in the context of speaking on a panel or roundtable. Today's session is interactive and we look forward to hearing from you. But before we get started, I need to cover just a couple items. Firstly, for sound quality, we ask that everyone remains muted unless speaking, just so we can all hear the great content coming from Spitfire and also when other participants are speaking. If you'd like to take notes during the call, you are welcome to, but just know that we will be following up with all relevant materials and a copy of the recording of this deck by the end of the day. And lastly, if you feel comfortable, we encourage you to have your camera on in this virtual world. It's great to start putting faces to names and help us feel like we're all sitting at the table together. Everyone on today's call has spoken with a member of our team and some have even taken the step to take direct action, such as speaking to a reporter, writing an op-ed, briefing policymakers, etc. Thank you all for your high level of engagement, and we're excited to continue the good work together. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our resident experts in strategic communications, Christine Mickelson and Annabelle Gardner of Spitfire Strategies. The Spitfire team is always available for more individual support or training if you would like. With that, Christine, I will hand it off to you.
Hey everybody, so great to see you all today. Let's dive in. So for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about best practices for being on a panel. Panels are a really great way to use your voice as a business leader on issues you care about. It's also a great way to share your thought leadership on an issue and to build connections that can lead to even more opportunities. Business Forward often hosts panels with decision makers and advocacy groups that business leaders can be a part of. So we're going to be talking about some strategies to help you with that today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Annabelle to get us going with strategy.
Hi, folks. My name is Annabelle Gardner. I'm a vice president with Spitfire Strategies, which, if this is your first time joining us, we are a strategic communications firm that supports Business Forward and its small business network to really spark change on the issues that you care most about as small business leaders. So you'll hear us start with this every single time we get on the phone, no matter what we're talking about. It always has to start with strategy. So if you're thinking about a panel, participating in a panel, being on a panel, you always want to start with strategy. So is the panel that you're going to participate on actually going to help you achieve your goals as a business leader and an advocate on issues you care about? To be successful, it should always be a yes or no based on that question. So let's say your goal is to push for legislators to do something about climate change. And maybe, as Naomi mentioned, that's a very specific policy related to preparedness, right? So like, is the panel that you want to participate on going to help you move forward towards that objective? Yes or no? And that's how you can help sort of decide whether an opportunity is right for you or not. Because of course, we all know we're all super busy. We've got a lot on our plate, whether that's as a business leader, an advocate on issues you care about, whatever that is. And so being strategic and using your time efficiently is going to have to be part of the calculus here. And luckily, Business Forward is able to help you sort of think through whether that panel is a good opportunity for you based on your goals. You also want to think about who it is that you need to reach. So again, this stuff you should be like ready to hear it from us every time we talk about anything, right? So know what you want to achieve and know who it is that you're going to reach. And is this panel an opportunity for you to get in front of those people? Is it funders? Is it other business leaders? Is it policymakers? These are all things that should go into your decision making when it comes to either opportunities with Business Forward or opportunities with panels in other sort of venues, as you're thinking about those. And you want to sort of use these as opportunities to evaluate the opportunity based on what it is you want to achieve. So like I said, your time is precious. Only take something that you know will actually help achieve your larger goals. And sometimes that larger goal is thought leadership, right? Like, I want to be known in this space. And that's a totally fine objective. You just want to make sure that this opportunity, based on who's going to be there, based on who's going to see it, is actually matching up with that objective. So always start with strategy. Next slide. Great. Okay, so let's say you've decided you're going to do this panel. It helps you achieve your objectives. It's going to reach the audience you need to reach, and you've decided that it's worthwhile of your very precious time. So now what? So these are a couple things to sort of keep in mind when it comes to sort of prepping for a panel discussion. So the first one, and this is similar to if you were here for our media update or media training, this is sort of similar to how you prepare to talk to a reporter, is that you want to anticipate the potential questions you're going to get while you're on that panel. And it could be as easy as asking the person who's leading the panel, can you send me the questions ahead of time so that you really feel like you have the time to prepare? It's also sometimes not the case that they can send you specific questions, or there might be questions that come up as part of a Q&A that you didn't necessarily have ahead of time. And so I always sit down before a panel and think about, okay, based on what the topic is, based on what's going on in the world, based on who's going to be in that room, what are some of the questions I can anticipate are going to come up? And how would I answer them if I get asked them? Right. So I also always recommend ahead of a panel, like the morning of, taking this quick scan of your local news, or if it's like a panel for a national audience, taking a quick scan of the national news, because often that can give you a sense of what some of those questions might be that could come up in a Q&A or that you hadn't otherwise sort of anticipated and planned for. So let's say Naomi, and I'm sorry, I keep picking on you, but I remember your client change example. So let's say you're getting on a panel and you're going to talk about two policymakers about suggested things related to climate change, and a hurricane warning comes on the news that morning. That is something that you should be aware of and integrate into your responses, because it is directly connected to what it is that you're there to talk about, right? So that's a pretty good example. It's also really important that you prepare your message ahead of time. And that sounds really like sort of duh. Of course, I'm going to prepare what I'm going to say ahead of time. But I think what people often do is try to say too many things at once. And so usually when it comes to being on a panel, you're only one person of multiple people that are going to be on that panel. And the amount of content or messaging that you're actually able to share is pretty limited, even if it's an hour-long panel, because it's split across a bunch of people. So when I'm thinking about what messaging I want to share on a panel, I try to come up with my 2 to 3 main points that I want to communicate to the audience in the span of this panel. And remember, that has to go back to what your objective is and who it is that you're trying to reach through the panel, right? So that'll adjust based on who the audience is and what you want to achieve. But I think 2 to 3 main points, and of course you can have additional like statistics or stories or whatever that build on those 2 to 3 main points, but really, really try to focus and push yourself to focus just on 2 to 3 main points. It's also really important to think about, okay, so, and do your research, this is kind of part of prep, about what you can say, what you can add that the other panel folks can't, right? Because the last thing you want to do when you get on a panel is actually just repeat something that someone before you said, because that really doesn't help further the conversation. It's not particularly compelling. And it kind of means that you sort of fade into the background when it comes to when people walk away from that panel. And again, we actually are here because we want to achieve something. So we don't want to fade into the background. So think about like, what is my unique expertise, lived experience? Maybe it's where you're from, maybe it's the type of business you do, whatever that is, and make sure that your 2 to 3 talking points are connected to that unique ad that you can build no matter what the question is, right? So do a little bit of research about who else is on the panel. A lot of times they'll actually send you stuff like that ahead of time so that you can get sort of a good idea. And even you could ask, what specific perspective do you think I add to this panel, so that you can make sure you're like meeting the expectation of the people who have invited you to be a part of this. So that's super important. Prepare your message and also think about what you uniquely can share. And again, just to sort of hammer this home, let's say someone says what you were about to say and they're before you on a panel and it comes to you, there's always an opportunity to build, So you can always say and use some of these bridging phrases that help you sort of feel more comfortable with that. It's like, I couldn't agree more with you, Claudia. But what I would build on based on my experience is X, right? So like that is a really powerful sort of bridge to get you to like, one, have a little bit more time to like prepare your thought, but also to like build on and remind yourself, oh, right, I'm not just going to repeat what this person just said. And like I said, you want to lean into that unique experience that you can have. And really, especially because we're talking about in this network, you joining business forward panels with other folks, like what is the business case or what is your experience as a small business leader that you can bring and build on the conversation? And then, of course, lastly, you gotta practice. Like you just have to practice. And I know that it's uncomfortable for a lot of folks to practice public speaking, but it's like the number one way to get more comfortable and confident in whether it's virtual or it's in person. Like you will never see a professional basketball player like stepping on the court without having practice, right? And the same is true no matter how many panels you do, you have to practice. And I would say some of the best ways to practice public speaking is actually to record yourself doing it. So you can get on Zoom with yourself and record yourself. You can stand in a mirror, record yourself, use your phone, whatever you do. But that helps you catch some of the things that you might not notice as you're speaking. So it helps you catch, do I use a lot of filler words like like what am I doing with my hands, right? Like, what is my body language showing? Am I looking away a lot? Like, those are the kinds of things that you can pick up on if you record and rewatch yourself. And then you can know to sort of, I have to practice making eye contact, or like, I need to practice taking a breath. I need to practice not speaking too quickly, right? So I would definitely recommend recording yourself, seeing what needs to be sort of shifted, and then using that as a helpful tool for practicing. All right, so those are the basics. It's also important as you're thinking about not only whether you say yes to a panel, but also how you prepare, is understanding the differences between an in-person opportunity and a virtual one. And there's pros and cons to both, especially like in this new world where we've got flu, we've got COVID, we've got all the things, right? So I would think about what kind of opportunity is best suited for you based on your objectives and audience, but also based on like what makes you feel most comfortable. So it could be that when you first get started with public speaking or first get started with panels, that you start virtual because it means you can have your notes in front of you, right? You don't want to be looking down. You want to make it very clear that you can still see, look forward and be a part of the conversation. But virtual can lend itself a little bit easier to having some like backup, right? So having some notes with you. However, some of the cons of virtual is that you're less likely to get that like in-person connection that you are in person. So like when we go to conferences and we actually spend the time to like shake hands, give our business card, build those connections, we know that those connections are usually more likely to like translate into something than they are if you're just on a Zoom with someone, right? So the other thing about sort of virtual is that it adds an element of preparation about like your environment that you need to keep in mind. And this is same goes for a virtual, interview with the media, right? So you want to be conscious about like, what's behind me? Is it distracting? Is there a book I don't want people to see that's behind me during this panel, right? So like being clear about what's behind you and how well people can see your face, your expressions. You also want to make sure that you're not going to get interrupted. So we all live with other people or tiny creatures like my dog that will interrupt phone calls sometimes. And so you want to make sure that you're going to be in a quiet space where you're not going to be interrupted. I was on an interview once where someone, it was a young person talking about young voters and civic engagement, and their mom came in to like ask about lunch. And like, that's not what you want when you're on the phone with a reporter, right? It's like, think about that. Also really important to make sure you do some tech checks before you get on the Zoom for a panel. And usually when people invite you to join a panel, they'll ask you to come a few minutes early so that you can do that. But like lighting, sound, all of that is super, super important when it comes to a virtual panel. And I would say both are virtual and in person, but it's a lot easier to forget when we're virtual because we're all sort of used to this new like working at home sort of vibe, is that people can still see your facial expression even when you're not speaking. And that's super important when it comes to a panel. So if you're someone like me that does not have a poker face, I need to be very thoughtful when I'm on camera and speaking with people or listening, that my face stays neutral, or that I'm like being an active participant in a conversation. So that means nodding when someone says something that you agree with. It means maybe smiling, right? It's just like you have to remember that even when you are not speaking, you are an active participant in a panel if you are on camera or in a physical space. So that's another thing to sort of remember. And that means like looking at the person who's talking, right? Some of this stuff that just like comes super naturally when we're in public spaces with people, but we sort of forget about, especially when we're like nervous about being on stage or being in sort of a public speaking setting. So when it comes to in person, there's less of the technical issues, and it also becomes a lot easier to actually gauge when to jump in. So sometimes with panels, it's very prescriptive, and the moderator is the one that's sort of saying, okay, now Wayne, I would love you to answer that question, right? So there's some settings where a moderator does that cueing for you and like lets you know when it's appropriate for you to speak. Sometimes that's not the case, and it's more sort of organic. And so it's really important to sort of learn and watch people's body language to know when it's appropriate to jump in. And I think one of the things that is always worth sort of thinking about, that I like to use as like a facilitation or public speaking thing, is we call it step up or step back. And so step up means if you're not hearing your voice very much in a panel conversation, that you sort of note that and find an opportunity where you feel comfortable to add your voice. Step back is the one that's equally important, and something I have to work on a lot, is that if you hear a lot of your voice in a panel, it's also a cue to you to step back and create space for others. And that can actually, you can do that like pretty either overtly, where you're just sort of clocking it on your own self and you give space and quiet to let other people jump in, or you can literally say, Jose, I'm really interested in what you have to say about that. Like, what do you think? Right. So you can also prompt people. And that's another way to sort of show that you're creating space for other people. But this is a huge, huge important part of both practicing and preparing when it comes to panels. And a lot of times, because people recognize like how much the dynamics across panelists matter, a lot of times they'll actually do a prep call ahead of time so that you all can meet each other and sort of think through some of these dynamics. Because if these dynamics are ignored, it can actually be sort of a risky endeavor sometimes, where it might, people come off thinking like, oh, that person really like took over the whole thing, or like, oh, that person, barely said anything, right? So those are kind of the things to consider, prepare for, be ready for, especially in person, because it's easier to sort of manage the cues about when it's good to jump in. If you are in person, I would generally say avoid using notes as best you can. Sometimes I'll have them with me as like almost like a security blanket, but I will very specifically flip them over. So because if you have your notes in front of you, no matter how prepared you are, you're going to be tempted to look at them. Right. So, and usually that turns into you sounding very scripted. And sometimes it can also come off as not as professional. Right. So I think in general, I would avoid bringing notes with you for a panel. And if you do bring them, I would make sure that they're small. Right. And that you actually have them flipped over, unless you like are really sort of lost for words. And then you have them there to sort of get you back on track. Right. And I would also just say a great moderator actually will help you out of those kinds of situations. So as like part of your deciding about whether or not a panel is a good opportunity, I would ask about who the moderator is and what kind of style or experience they have moderating, because you can be the best panelist in the world, and if you have a moderator that's like not going to help you out, that can be really challenging. And then again, just to name, like, be aware of your body language. Like, it's one thing on video, it's a very different thing when it comes to in person. So even just like whether your arms are crossed can make you seem like maybe you're not as open or friendly or forthcoming. Like, these are the kinds of things just to sort of keep in mind. Also, how fast you talk, things like that. All of which I think videoing and practicing can make it so much easier to feel confident about. And now I'm going to pass it over to Christine to talk more tips and tricks.
Great. So yeah, a few tips and tricks just to make this a little bit easier and also a little bit less intimidating. The first one is to take a breath before answering. It's okay and even expected that you pause. This might feel like an agonizing couple of seconds to you, but it really gives you the space that you need to refer back to those 2 to 3 main points that you came up with before you entered and navigate back to those. It's not a race to start talking first. And sometimes if you do, you kind of start going and you don't know where you're going yet. So take that breath, pause, decide what points you want to make, and then go there. And this also helps for our fast talkers like me to slow down a little bit. Makes you a lot more understandable for an audience. The other piece is to keep it simple, use clear language, and avoid jargon. Not everybody in every audience will be intimately familiar with the details of your work or your position. So you want to make sure that you avoid that really complex language, especially as you're auditory. People aren't going to be as fast to pick up on those more complex topics. And the example that I always give is if I'm introducing myself, I don't say, "Hi, I'm Christine. I work in strategic communications," because a lot of people don't really understand what that means. But I will say, "Hi, I'm Christine, and I help people tell their stories." That makes sense to people. Since we're talking about stories, the thing that you really want to do to drive points home for people is to emphasize stories and then back them up with facts and figures. Emotions are really the key to get people to engage with the point that you're making and remember the point that you're making. And the easiest way to connect to people's emotions is to tell stories that invoke them. And then, so it's not just storytelling and you're driving home the fact that you have the evidence. You want to back this up with facts and figures. But when you're doing this, you want to really make sure that you put facts and figures into context for people. Don't just throw out numbers, because sometimes people don't know what those numbers mean. My favorite example of this is if I tell you that Oregon has 280 marijuana dispensaries, you're like, is that a lot? Is that a little? It's not. It's a lot of land, but how many people live there? But if I tell you that Oregon has more marijuana dispensaries than McDonald's, now you're like, okay, that is probably a lot of marijuana dispensaries. So remember to put those facts and figures into context. You want to make sure that you don't speculate or move away from your expertise. You were brought onto this panel for a really specific reason and for your specific expertise, and you want to make sure you don't deviate from those. Remember those points that you want to make and always pivot back to them with those bridging phrases that Annabelle gave you earlier. And if a question is asked that you asked specifically to you that you don't feel positioned to answer, it's okay to say so. It's okay to say, actually, I don't know a ton about this, but I think so and so, one of my other participants might have a better take on this. Or to say, I don't know much about this, but what I do know is, and then go back to those points that you have. It's okay to say that's not a question for me, and you don't want to start going somewhere that you really don't know or don't want to head. The other point is to be brief. Make sure that you're succinct, that you're staying on topic. It's really important on panels to prioritize brevity so that audiences stay engaged. And we've all been attendants at a panel where somebody gets a little bit long-winded and you start tuning them out. Don't be that person. The other thing to do is to flag key points so that your audience knows exactly what to take away. And this is literally as simple as saying, the most important thing to take away is blank. And this will, even if your audience is starting to tune out, if it's later in the panel, everybody will perk up and say like, oh wait, I'm getting the golden nugget. I'm getting the thing that I want to take away from here. So flag that for them, make it easy for them to lean in.
Thank you, Annabelle, and everyone who participated in today's training. That is all we have time for today. For those of you that would like to put today's learnings into action, Business Forward is here to help. Business Forward is here to help support you. Please reach out to either myself or Maggie for next steps. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you so much, Annabelle and the Spitfire team, for supporting the business leaders on today's call. We look forward to continuing our work together. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you.